is that he's actually shown them, despite their current circumstances, beyond what they can see, that there was still hope for their lives. And that's what the coming of Christ the first time was for us. Man was in a bleak circumstance. We were in a really bad circumstance. And what Jesus did is, what God did, he sent his son the first time to let us know we still got hope beyond our circumstances. So I want to encourage you this morning, because sometimes we're looking forward for our hope, but I want to tell you, you can look backward this morning at what already happened, and that will give you all the reason in the world to have hope. I want you to find what we're going to look at today is the assurance that comes from the first advent. Are you guys ready? Yes. And how that can encourage your heart in this season. Let's jump in. I ain't going to be long. Thank you. Just testing y'all and make sure I know it's raining today, and make sure you're on your game. Isaiah 7, if you're not on the Bible app, we're going to be in Isaiah 7, 1 through 2, 7, 10 through 14. Here we go. When Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was the king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, and Pekah, son of Ramalek, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. That actually is Israel there. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says, it will not take place. It ain't going to happen. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or the highest heights. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? He's like, you're getting on my nerves, basically. Will you try the patience of my God also? He said, don't even worry about it. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. You didn't ask for it, but he's going to give it anyway. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call his name Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. In other words, he's going to be just still on baby food. And before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and all your people and all the house of your fathers a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. All right, we're going to jump in. There's a lot in that, so I just want to take a few moments and break it down. So Israel at one point was a united kingdom, but there was a time that came that the kingdom divided. And so you had the northern kingdom, which was Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was Judah. In the northern kingdom, there were 10 tribes. Remember, Israel's 12 tribes, right? So the northern kingdom, there's 10 tribes. The southern kingdom, there are 2. One of those tribes is the tribe of Judah. And Judah is now a small group, just 2 tribes versus 10 tribes of its family in the north. And Israel in the north has joined forces with a country called Syria. And so Israel and Syria are plotting to come against Judah. And I want you to imagine that. I want you just to sort of liken the idea of the kingdom being divided sort of to like the Civil War in the United States, the north against the south. And so Judah knows that they are the one that will lose and that they will be desolated. And not only that, but Israel's gotten the help of a foreign nation. So King Ahaz is who this passage is about. He's worried, as is all of Judah, that they have no hope, that things are going to go from bad to worse, that they're going to be destroyed, they're going to be overtaken. So Isaiah goes to King Ahaz and says to him, that's not going to happen. I know you're afraid. I know you're like a leaf shaking in the wind, but you ain't even got to worry about it. They're plotting it. They're talking about it. It's all over Fox. It's all over CNN. It ain't going to happen, though. So Isaiah is trying to reassure him because God wanted this king to be reassured. Let me go back and say that when the kingdom split, and you read about these in Kings and Chronicles, it's all about the kings of both of those, the northern and the southern. Most of the kings in the north were evil kings. There were about 2 kings that were decent kings over centuries. And then in the south, there's really about 4, few more, but not a whole lot. And some of those you know, King David, Hezekiah, Solomon, and somebody else I can't think of right now. They were good kings, but mostly the kings were evil and the people were following after them, right? And so Ahaz is an evil king. But Isaiah comes to him and says, don't worry about it. God knows that he ain't doing right. He said, but don't even worry about it. I'm going to protect you because the other king wants to take his throne, and I'm going to protect the people of Judah. And the reason why God says that he's going to protect them is because there's a promise over Judah. And what's the promise over Judah? You would know this, that the promise over Judah is that a Messiah would come and a king would sit on the throne of David. You guys following? So he says, I'm not going to let you go down, because if you go down, there's no throne for the king to sit on the throne of David. There's nothing. So he says, I'm going to protect Judah so that this doesn't happen to you. So Ahaz hears the word, and after he hears the word, Isaiah said, all right, so I know you're still a little shaken about all that's going on. I know you're still worried about what's happening. I know you don't know how things are going to turn out between now and New Year's. I know you got some bills to pay that look a little due. He said, but since you're so worried, he said, ask the Lord for a sign. As high as the heavens, as low as the earth below. Essentially, ask the Lord for a miraculous sign. You could ask God for whatever you want. Ask him for whatever. The sky is the limit. Ask him for what you want. You name it, you could ask him for it right now. He's going to show you that he got your back. Amen. It's yours for the asking. Take it. Whatever you want to see. Now, I don't know about y'all, but you wouldn't have to tell me twice. I want this, that, and the other thing. Ain't got nothing to do with what you're talking about, but I want those too. But Ahaz doesn't do that. Ahaz says, nah, that's all right. Now, Isaiah, Deuteronomy 6:16 talks about we don't want to put the Lord, our God, to the test. He don't know in the future Jesus will use that same scripture against Satan in the wilderness. But they all know, as people of good Jewish kids and adults, that you don't put God to the test. And so what Isaiah turns back around and says is, essentially, because you have refused this, there's going to be some consequences. And you have to stop and say, well, was the king right? Because it sounded like he was really trying to be pious. Like, I don't want to cross the line with God. You're asking me to ask God for a sign, but the Bible says don't tempt the Lord, so I'm not going to ask God. But what I need you to understand this morning was that tempting God and putting God to the test looks different when we initiate it. It looks different when we do it out of a heart of unbelief. It wasn't the king that was asking God to prove himself. It was God saying, how would you like me to reassure you? So instead of Ahaz being pious, he was actually being rebellious. And you can see that in the text, because you can hear Isaiah's tone change, like, how long are we going to have to put up with you? First, you're getting on my nerves. You're getting on people's nerves. And now you're trying to come against God, who's trying to help you. You already wasn't doing right. You're already out of place. Here comes God's mercy to show up. And then you come back with this other statement. And we could kind of do a little bit of Ahaz kind of stuff, because, it sounds spiritual. It sounds right. Somebody come up to you and say, why don't you do this? Well, Pastor, I don't feel it in my spirit. I just wasn't led. I got to use wisdom. So he looked like that. And the prophet shot right through that. He shot right through that, because the truth of the matter was, this is what you need to know, historical context. The truth of the matter was, he didn't want the sign because he didn't want God to interrupt the plan he already had. I ain't got time for that miraculous stuff. Not now. I already have a plan. His plan for Syria, and we're talking about three nations, for Syria and Israel, was to form an alliance with Assyria, total different nation. And that he would trust the king of Assyria to help him beat his enemies instead of trusting God. And that was rebellious. Can you imagine God coming, sending a word to you about his plan to keep you from your enemy? His plan to ensure your victory. His plan to ensure that you're not defeated, that you're not decimated, that you're not taken out of the land, that you can stand whatever comes your way, and you refuse it. Because you heard the word, but you heard the word already having your mind made up. See, this king came into the scenario already knowing he had planned to align with Assyria. So even though he heard the word, He wasn't interested in God's answer because he already had his own answer. He wasn't interested in God's plan because he already had his own plan. How many times do we go to church on a Sunday morning, we hear the word that God has a purpose and a plan for our life, but we think our plan is better. We hear the word that if God be for you, who can be against you? That he's got a plan for you and for your victory, but we think our plan is better. How many times do we hear the word of the Lord come to us and say that I've got a plan to prosper you and do you no harm, but we think our plan is better? Y'all ain't gonna say nothing. How many times do we hear God's plan and say, I've got a plan in your life to defeat sin in your life, but we think our plan is better. We have a plan to get off our addiction, but God, we think our plan is better than God's plan. And what the prophet says to him, he says, okay, well, here's the deal. He says, you're right. Assyria is going to come and take out Israel. Assyria is, and they did. They took them out and got them right out the land. Assyria is going to take out Israel, and Assyria is also going to take out Syria. He said, because that was my plan. That was my judgment on them for their evil and their idolatry. So my plan is going to remain. He said, but what you didn't know is the person that you're aligning with, Assyria, is going to come and desolate your land too. What you didn't know is that Assyria is going to come after because you have refused the word of Allah, because you walked in your plan. Judgment will come on you and on your nation, and that those that remain will be under Assyria paying tribute to them. How many of y'all know that when you go with your plan, you always pay a price? Because when God has a plan, he has a plan seeing the whole thing from the beginning to the end, from the ending back to the beginning. When we got a plan, all we can see is right in front of us. But what I love about it, what he was saying to him essentially is, my plan is going to remain. Your plan might fail, but my plan will remain. This morning, church, I need you to understand that when your plan fails, God's plan remains. When your plan fails for your life, God's plan remains. If you go back into the scripture, Adam and Eve had a plan to become like God. Their plan failed, but God's plan remained. They had a plan to build the Tower of Babel, which ascend to the heavens. Man's plan failed, but God's plan remained. Pharaoh had a plan to kill baby Moses. He was going to find him and kill him so a deliverer wouldn't come. Pharaoh's plan failed. God's plan remained. David went out to fight against Goliath. Goliath's plan was to kill David. David killed Goliath because Goliath's plan failed, but God's plan remained. Haman went to the king trying to exterminate all the Jews. And instead, he got himself eliminated because his plan failed, but God's plan remained. Herod tried to kill all the babies in Bethlehem because he knew that a Savior would be born. He knew the Messiah was coming, but Herod's plan failed. God's plan remained. Judas tried to betray Christ thinking he was going to make himself better. His plan failed. God's plan remained. Satan thought that he had finally had Christ on the cross. His plan failed. I'm here today because God's plan remains. So when your plan fails, when my plan fails, God's plan remains. No matter what you're facing and what you've been through, in the areas in your life that you've missed it, or things didn't happen the way you thought it was going to happen, I need you to understand that God's plan remains, and it's unchanged in your life. You can't change God's plan in your life. Sin can't change it. Idolatry can't change it. Shame can't change it. Guilt can't change it. Rebellion can't change it. Witchcraft can't change it. Things above can't change it. Things below can't change it. Things in front of you can't change it. Things behind you can't change it. Things under you can't change it. No principality can change it. Power can't change it. Darkness can't change it. Death can't change it. God's plan for your life remains unchanged. Jesus. And that's one of the assurances of Advent. The fact that Jesus made it, because that promise went back thousands of years before his birth. And every one of those situations I just preached about, if one of those had happened, he would have never came through. With the extermination of Jews, Jesus would have never been born. If Adam and Eve had became God, he would have never been born. God's plan remains unchanged. It remains. When it's all said and done, when my plans fall apart, his plan remains unchanged. And that assures me that no matter what I face, that he still has a plan. If I'm alive and he's still God, and I think both of those are true at the moment because I'm still here, he'll always be God. His plan for my life still is unchanged. You can be assured. You can be assured. You might be facing grief right now. His plan is unchanged for your life. You might be facing unemployment. God's plan is unchanged. You might be facing age and wonder how far death is. Can I tell you, God's plan remains unchanged? It is unchanged. I don't care who left you. Hey, God's plan is unchanged. It doesn't matter what people say about you. His plan is unchanged. You might have got fired. His plan is unchanged. It remains. When your plans fail, God's plan remains. And let me tell you something about God's plan. It trumps everybody else's. It is the ace in the game of spades. It trumps everybody else's. And even though Ahaz refuses the sign, and Isaiah rebukes him, he still says that after all is said and done, a baby is going to be born, and that baby would somehow represent God being with his people. And that the immediate crisis they were going through would not stop the Davidic line that was prophesied the Messiah would come through. This text is a bit challenging, but I'm going to kind of see if I can make it real simple. There's a few places, more than a few, a handful of places in the Bible where there's a prophecy and it has an immediate fulfillment. And then there's a big distance and it goes into the New Testament and has an ultimate fulfillment. Are you following me? Because when this was spoken or this happened, it was 721 or something like that, BC. And so Jesus being born around one, a little bit before then, 700 years later, I don't know how that would comfort me if that was the answer to what I'm going through 700 years early. Does that make sense? It's almost like me saying, you're going to get paid on Friday. Yeah, but they evicted me on Tuesday. It's like, that's nice, I'm going to get paid on Friday, but it ain't going to help me today. But it actually does, because this is one of the passages in the Bible that fulfills itself once, and the people of the day probably thought that was the only fulfillment, but by the New Testament, it becomes the ultimate fulfillment. And so Isaiah prophesies that a baby is going to be born, and that king would know by that baby being born, not just being born, but before that baby's off of baby food and onto solid food, he would know right from wrong, and the two kings that threatened Judah would be destroyed. And so what he's telling him is essentially, this baby that's there is going to represent that God is with you when you're facing an enemy. Then you fast forward 700 years, and Jesus is born, and Matthew says in 1:22, and all this took place, a virgin shall conceive, by the way, it's before that, to fulfill what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Let me go back real quick. In Isaiah's text, this is all I'm going to say because it's nuanced. In Isaiah's text, there's, in the Greek language and the Hebrew language, there's more than one word for a particular thing. In the Old Testament, the word that Isaiah used could be a virgin, as in, like we know Mary was a virgin. You guys follow me? Or it could also mean a young married woman. A young woman who's able to be married, but hasn't married. Are you following me? So what he's saying to Isaiah, what Isaiah is saying to Ahaz is, there's a woman that's of marriage age that's going to essentially get married and have a baby, and that baby's going to represent God to us. You fast forward to the New Testament, there's a different word used for virgin. It means somebody who's never had sexual intercourse. Are you following me? And so that is the ultimate fulfillment coming through Christ. In both cases, there was an enemy. There was an enemy of a nation on one side, of nations on one side, and when Jesus is born, we're surrounded by an enemy too. We're surrounded by an enemy that wants to steal, kill, and destroy. We're surrounded by an enemy the enemy in me, the sin in me, that wants to bring death upon me. And so, just like the enemy that wanted to destroy Judah in the Old Testament, so does the sin in my life want to destroy me in the New Testament. And when you really get this, because see, at the root of all of it, at the root of most of really all of our troubles, let me just say it this way, at the root of sickness is sin. Mm-hmm. At the root of divorce is sin. At the root of bitterness is sin. At the root of pride is sin. At the root of theft, it's sin. At the root of backbiting, it's sin. At the root of breakups, it's sin. At the root of pain, it's sin. At the root of shame, it's sin. The problems of this world are not caused by anything other than basically sin. Sin robs us of our potential. Sin robs us of our destiny that God has for us. Sin breaks down communities. Sin destroys businesses. Sin causes grief. It's because of sin in man. And what God says is the answer to both, the enemy that Judah faces and the sin that we face is a person. It's Emmanuel. And it interprets Emmanuel for us. Emmanuel means God with us. God with us. And in the New Testament, John says, we beheld his glory, that of the only begotten of the Father. And he says it this way. He says that the Word became flesh. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And dwelt among us. If you lived in, when it was written, this is how you would have heard it. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. That's the translation from the Greek. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. In other words, let me read it one more time. I'm going to read it from the Message translation that breaks it to the common sound of their day in street language. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. In other words, he didn't just come visit, he moved in. God with us. The answer to sin is God moving in. God being with us and moving in. He visited in the Old Testament. He visited Abraham. 3 men visited Abraham. God visited in the Old Testament. He came down and visited Moses and gave the 10 Commandments. But he didn't visit in Jesus. He moved in. He didn't just stop by for a meal. He moved in. He pitched his tent. He set up shop. He became one of us. He put on a tent of flesh and dwelt among us. Because he's with us. And let me say this. Because he is with you, no matter what you face, you never face it alone. I'm going to say that again. Because he's with us, no matter what you face, you never face it alone. So if you face loss this morning, you're not facing it alone. He's with you. If you're facing heartache right now, you're not facing it alone. He's with you. If you're facing sickness this morning in your body, you're not facing it alone. He's with you. If you're facing bankruptcy right now, you're not alone. He's with you. If you've been betrayed, you're not alone. He's with you. But this is the part I like, and I'm almost done. Forget it. Nah, I'm done now. I'm taking my tent someplace else. Ahaz tells Judah, he says, the baby that you see is going to be born amongst you to let you know that he represents God is with you. He said, and because essentially God is with you, Israel ain't going to defeat you. Syria is not going to defeat you. And that tells me something. It tells me not only is God for us, not only is God with us, God is for us. Because there's a difference between somebody being with you and for you. Let me say this. Not everybody with you is for you. I walked with a lot of folks over the years, and I look back and I started connecting dots. I said, oh, you was with me, but you wasn't always for me. Some of y'all got some friends that are with you, but they're not for you. Some colleagues that are with you, but they ain't for you. God said, I'm not just going to be with you, I'm for you, that the enemy that desires to destroy you will not succeed. It won't work. It won't happen. It'll come to naught. It won't last. It won't have the impact that he planned to have on your life. Because not only am I with you, but I'm for you. And I think sometimes the hardest thing for us is to know, even when we've missed the mark, that God has not given up on us. He's not turned his back. He's not forsaken us. That he's still with us and he's still for us. I don't care what guilt is telling you this morning. Emmanuel, God is with you. And God with you is God for you. Even when you fall into a pit, even when you fall into sin. I want to read a little story and I'm done. Y'all can basically come on down. I told you I was done. A man fell into a pit and couldn't get himself up. Couldn't get himself out. A subjective person came along and said, I feel for you down there. An objective person came along and said, it's logical that someone would fall down there. A Christian scientist came along and said, you only think you're in a pit. A Pharisee said, only bad people fall into the pit. A mathematician calculated how he fell into the pit. Confucius said, if you had listened to me, you would not be in the pit. Buddha said, your pit is only a state of mind. A realist said, that's a pit. Yeah. A scientist said, calculate the pressure necessary to get him out of the pit. A geologist told him to appreciate the rock strata in the pit. An evolutionist said, you're a rejected mutant destined to be removed from the evolutionary cycle. In other words, you're going to die in the pit. A county inspector came by and said, you don't have a pit. You don't have a permit to be in the pit. A professor came and gave a lecture on the elementary principles of the pit. I'm almost there. An evasive person came along and avoided the subject of his pit altogether. A self-pitying person said, you haven't seen anything until you've seen my pit. An optimist said, things could be worse. A pessimist said, things will get worse. Jesus, seeing the man, took him by the hand and lifted him out of the pit. That's what it looks like for God not just to be with you, but God to be for you. That when you can't get yourself out of sin, that when you can't get yourself out of addiction, that when you can't get yourself out of sickness, that when you can't get yourself out of a situation, Jesus comes to you, takes you by the hand, and lifts you up. Advent is exciting because when we could not go to God, when we could not come to God, God came to us. That nothing between heaven and earth could stop God from coming to us and getting us out of the pit. Hallelujah. Glory, glory, glory.